This week on the Wheelhouse. June is Pride Month, but across the states, anti-trans rhetoric is prevalent. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. There's been an explosion of bills moving through state legislatures to block gender-affirming health care for transgender youth. It's a topic that's swirling with misinformation, much of which we in the media aren't exactly clearing up. And it's not only transgender youth that receive gender-affirming care. So today we're breaking down some of the basics, like what exactly is gender-affirming care? Why do people need it? Why are lawmakers banning it? We're going to have science, rhetoric, much more. To kick us off, I'm joined by Joanna Wiest, Assistant Professor of Politics at Mount Holyoke College up in Massachusetts. Joanna, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So glad to have you here. Let's begin our discussion. Before we do, I just want to tell folks, give us a call right now. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Hey, something we're going to talk about today, Joanna, is how a small portion of Americans want politicians to focus on restrictions to gender-affirming care. We're going to get into that a little later, but first, the misinformation surrounding gender-affirming care. We can start with some of the basics. What is gender-affirming care exactly, and why is it important?
So, gender-affirming care actually includes many different things, and that's important to say right from the start, because critics of gender-affirming care, they would have you believe that there's this rapidly moving conveyor belt for transition. But instead, it's highly individualized, and it can include supportive, or we might call it affirmative therapy, puberty suppressing medication given to someone on the verge of adolescence. We have your hormonal replacement therapies, and then surgical interventions. But we should also note that children do not get surgeries, or children do not even get hormonal replacements. So not only is gender-affirming care highly individualized, it is also kind of administered in very kind of age-sensitive ways.
And not just these remedies for one group of folks, as it might be. You talked about the rapid conveyor belt. Who might get gender-affirming care? And give us some examples, if you can, of therapeutic and medical procedures a person may seek.
So this is really important because while I've mentioned, that a trans woman, for instance, might take estrogen as well as drugs that suppress testosterone, gender-affirming care is pursued by all sorts of people, and especially cisgender people. So, for example, hormonal replacement therapy really comes from postmenopausal treatments for cis women who kind of lack the feeling of what it felt like to be more kind of feminine when estrogen was more naturally flowing in their bodies. Testosterone supplements are becoming kind of increasingly popular for cis men who want to really affirm what it means to them to be masculine. And then we also see kind of a range of surgical interventions we might call breast augmentation for cis women, a form of gender-affirming care. But of course, we don't find those things nearly as controversial as we do gender transition related.
I would imagine the lawmakers in question here, the opposition, are not targeting cis men who are taking eugenics. I hear these commercials all the time. I have low T, but now I'm playing as great as I did back in the day with Coach Carter. And I imagine that they're not targeting these postmenopausal cis women that you're talking about. What is the opposition, and who is politicizing medical and therapeutic care for all?
Right. So there is a range of folks who are opposing this kind of care. At the state level, we have Republican lawmakers and legislatures and governor houses who kind of passed the gender-affirming care bans for minors, would be the most kind of common form of legislative ban. But they're not working alone, right? So we have organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a deep-pocketed conservative legal organization that defends a lot of these bans in court in various ways. We have groups like the Family Research Council that has been really essential to actually drafting model legislation for gender affirming care bans that then gets distributed all across the country into the hands of lawmakers who then can very easily take some passages from that model and submit it to the floor of their state law house.
There's this concern that these lawmakers have, or at least one that they're making public, where we talked about this earlier, where younger folks they're concerned that they're going to get surgeries, and there's this transition happening. Are some people worried that younger folks who decide to undergo any kind of gender affirming medical care will change their mind? And then I guess how reasonable is that worry?
Definitely. So we see a lot of fear mongering, not just in conservative spaces and conservative litigation and media, but really also on the pages of the New York Times, regrettably, as well. And one powerful narrative that we hear all of these folks kind of push is that adolescents are engaging in gender transition and then they are detransitioning. And in that narrative, detransition becomes synonymous with regret. That is, the only reason a person would detransition is because they got something horribly wrong. Again, that's how the narrative goes. But we have studies that show us that actually detransition is not at all synonymous with regret. For instance, many folks detransition because they have trouble securing and maintaining employment, because they have discriminatory bosses, for instance. They might encounter stigma in their social groups, stigma among family members. So all of these sorts of things, some studies show us, are actually far more determinative when a person detransitions rather than this kind of simple narrative of, well, the gender affirming care clinicians rushed them into a process that they now regret.
And there has to be you have to be a candidate in order to receive this kind of care. So help me understand what gender affirming care actually looks like for younger kids, maybe in their teens, adolescents.
Right. So again, critics will make it sound like children, very young children, are candidates for hormonal replacement therapies, for surgical interventions, even. But this is so far from the truth, actually. So for children, the most common form of gender affirming care is going to be affirmative therapeutic care. And that is, a child will meet with a gender identity clinician trained in mental health care who will help them kind of talk through their feelings of gender identity and provide an affirmative, supportive context for that child, no matter what path that they take. Again, this is not a conveyor belt kind of, as soon as you meet a gender identity clinician at the age of 5, there's no guarantee that you are going to transition later on. But some do. Also, children, like I mentioned, on the kind of cusp of puberty can have access to puberty suppressing medications that can delay that process, giving folks kind of time to decide their own kind of gender identity before puberty changes start to settle in. And then once we get to adolescence and later adolescence years, then you're talking about maybe the beginning of hormonal replacement therapies, maybe even something like top surgery for trans men, for instance. But that is much, much closer to and including adulthood.
You talked earlier about detransition stats, or at least these studies that people are pointing to, whether or not they are founded or not. But let's talk about any kind of statistics or any kind of study on mental health. And we talked about stigma earlier and what gender affirming care can do positively for an individual who is seeking it.
This is really important. So we have work by those like University of California, San Francisco professor and gender identity clinician Jack Turbin, who has done many studies on this front. One particular recent study showed that adolescents who were able to access some form of gender-affirming care. Specifically in that study, we were talking about hormones. They ended up having better mental health outcomes as adults than those adolescents who wanted but could not receive, for whatever reason, gender-affirming care. So again, we are increasingly amassing an evidence base that shows us that gender-affirming care can be incredibly beneficial for someone's mental health. We also have a lot of studies showing the harms of coercive so-called conversion therapies, which nearly half of the country has now banned, actually. And that's because we know that much trauma and even suicidality can be the result of coercively trying to get someone to disaffirm their sense of gender identity.
We talked about Jack Turpin's studies. What about Joanna Weiss's studies? Can you talk a little bit about the study you came out with last year and some of those major findings that you all had?
Sure thing. So I published a paper recently with Brianna Last of Stony Brook University, and there we discovered what we call a network of, and our term here is agents of scientific uncertainty. And this network
that sounds like
spreads
the Justice League or something like that, but the villainy kind of Justice League.
It's ominous, right? But I think we chose that term for this very reason, because this really is a network that spreads these unfounded claims that gender-affirming care is so dangerously uncertain, sometimes their language is experimental, that these care practices need to be banned legislatively. And this network does this by twisting and distorting the evidence base that we have, as well as outright asserting sometimes that gender-affirming care is akin to past medical atrocities committed by the Nazis and American eugenicists and white supremacists in the kind of history of vulnerable minority populations being subjected to these kinds of draconian interventions. And so here we're also comparing the folks who spread and the network that spreads these claims of uncertainty to scholars' work who have traced other what they call merchants of doubt. And so folks may be familiar with the merchants of doubt concept when we think about why some scientists were brought to the public to dispel the idea that secondhand smoke was actually dangerous. And of course, those scientists were working closely with the tobacco industry. We see a similar phenomenon happen in the fossil fuel industry, where those corporations were able to find some medical experts that were not at all kind of representative of consensus science, but they could be brought out with their credentials to say things like, we don't know so much about the human impact on climate change, and we should be skeptical about interventions into regulating things like coal and other kind of fossil fuel burning plants.
When you said the pejorative term there earlier, the Nazi medical experiment, and you bring up these doctors that in past industries, we even saw it in the COVID epidemic, where you'd have some doctor be brought to some kind of happening and speaking about maybe they found somebody to speak ill of the COVID vaccine or something like that. What are real doctors saying about all this?
Right. So real doctors have an unusual kind of consensus on these state bans on gender-affirming care for minors in particular. And so we've seen all sorts of medical and mental health associations, ranging from the American Medical Association to the American Academy of Pediatrics, to United States-based and international-based gender identity care, mental and medical associations. All of these associations of professionals have affirmed that gender-affirming care does have a role in healthcare today, and that these bans are not only harmful, but they are harmful because we have an increasing evidence base that shows that folks really need access to this form of care, and we shouldn't be banned.
I want to read something brief from your study here, where you say, quote, "There is some uncertainty in gender-affirming care, but..." You help me fill that in, Joanna.
The but is very important because we shouldn't at all say that there's no uncertainty in gender affirming care, but that's because there's uncertainty in all sorts of healthcare medical practices. And we practice medicine in a kind of context of some acceptable uncertainty. So that happens everywhere from surgeries beyond gender affirming care. There's an element of uncertainty, but there's also uncertainty in pharmaceutical drugs. And so you hear critics really talk a lot about the fears of what they'll say off-label prescriptions for trans children, particularly concerning puberty suppressing drugs. And this is also a little obfuscating, and I think intentionally so, because puberty suppressing drugs were originally developed for children undergoing puberty at too rapid and too early of a rate. And this is what they were developed for. This is what they were kind of approved by the Food and Drug Administration in that population to be used for. For trans children and questioning children, when they're prescribed puberty suppressing drugs, it's deemed dangerously off label. But really, there's no uncertainty actually about the effect that those drugs are going to have, as well as the kind of side effects that the FDA has deemed acceptable in allowing these drugs to go to market. So again, there is plenty of uncertainty in gender affirming care, but that's just because we have lots of uncertainty in our medical system in general.
So then when we see the reasoning behind state bans and kind of why we're here today, should really be on the lookout for scientific studies that are faulty or biased, right? I mean, that's essentially what we're pointing to right now. Is that one way to look past disinformation or misinformation and understand what we're seeing?
That's definitely one way to go, and I think an important one. I think most clearly we can see statements issued by organizations like the American Medical Association that will give you kind of the up-to-date perspective from experts on these treatments and forms of care. And you can see that that's going to be very different than some of the folks who are trotted out to defend bans on gender affirming care. So for instance, in the litigation over Arkansas's ban, which was the first of its kind, we saw defenders of the ban bring folks to the court who had medical degrees and they had experience, but many of them had no experience in gender identity or affirming care at all. So one of these folks was a plastic surgeon, but again, they have a medical degree. And when you see someone quoted with a medical degree, with some sort of even institutional affiliation in a news report, it's very easy to assume that person has the credentials and has the experience to be trusted. But unfortunately, that's what this agents of uncertainty thing is all about. And that is, this very strategic use of people with credentials to make us believe that this is not as sure as it really is.
Apparently, Ollie the octopus has my tongue this morning because that's what I was trying to convey regarding the COVID pandemic and finding any doctor or anybody with a medical degree to say that. I'm just trying to make sure that we're contextualizing that. So thank you for that, Joanna. That's why you're so good here. We talk about the rapid conveyor belt evocative kind of statement you made earlier, and the agents of scientific uncertainty, these kind of things that you say. So just tell me here, we shouldn't be necessarily looking to the lawmaker to give us the science. Maybe we're looking at the AMA or the American Academy of Pediatrics. Maybe those are the kind of places we go to.
I think that's definitely right. And I think sadly, the agents of uncertainty have been so powerful that they're likely turning folks against trans rights because they've been bombarded with fear mongering and stuff that looks like scientific pronouncements of fact, right? And so that's why we see organizations like the Public Religion Research Institute, or PRRI, show us that increasing numbers of Americans are now favoring bans on gender affirming care. And some folks are saying that people advocating for trans rights have gone, quote, too far in recent years. And I encourage us to think of that as an artifact of how widespread these claims about scientific uncertainty have become. And my hope is that as we kind of dispel those untruths and those distortions of the medical record, that folks will understand again that gender affirming care is salutary, it's important, it's potentially life-saving, and we have no business banning this kind of medical treatment.
These are resources people could use to combat misinformation. But you mentioned something else, a different kind of organization earlier. You talked about the Alliance Defending Freedom. These groups, like the Family Research Council as well, they're writing these bills that are coming up at state capitol buildings, right? In addition to defending folks that are anti-trans in court and things like that in lawsuits?
Definitely. The Alliance Defending Freedom is particularly kind of scary organization for people concerned with queer rights more generally. I mean, this is the extremely well-funded Christian conservative legal organization that appears almost annually before the Supreme Court now, defending the rights of bigoted business owners to refuse service to would-be queer customers, and all these sorts of things that are really eroding very recently won rights for queer people. And so we need to kind of keep our focus on these groups that have been really kind of instrumental in defending gender-affirming care bans, as well as a host of other kind of attacks on trans rights.
To combat the misinformation, right? Any final thought there? I think you just kind of got to it.
Yes, definitely. I think my final thought would be we should be very skeptical of arguments that gender-affirming care is so uncertain, experimental, dangerous, that we should accept some sort of limitations and even legal bans. I think that is what we really need to focus on combating, the really kind of untruths and distortions of fact that undergird those claims and projects.
This is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Thank you so much, Professor Weiss, for coming on the show. And congratulations. Joanna is now the incoming assistant professor of gender and sexuality studies at Stony Brook.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
And Professor Weiss, also the author of Born This Way, Science, Citizenship, and Inequality in the American LGBTQ plus Movement. That's available through the University of Chicago Press. Thank you so much again, Professor.
Thank you.
Talking about the politics behind recent anti-trans legislation. There's so much misinformation out there regarding the transgender community. That misinformation can be used to bolster policies, as we just heard. Coming up, we're going to talk to Northwestern professor Dr. TJ Billard and Caitlin Burns, columnist, MSNBC, and host of the Cancel Me Daddy podcast, about some of the legislation moving through the Capitol right now that will impact the LGBTQ plus community, and how the reporting on those bills doesn't always get it right. If you want to join the conversation, give us a call, 888-720-9677. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. A wave of anti-trans legislation has swept across the country in recent years. Some of that legislation has targeted gender-affirming care, which we just talked about with Joanna Weiss, professor at Mount Holyoke College. Now I'm joined by Associate Professor at Northwestern, Dr. TJ Billard. TJ, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Happy to be here.
Happy to have you here. And Caitlin Burns, columnist, MSNBC, and host of the Cancel Me Daddy podcast. Welcome, Caitlin.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. TJ and Caitlin are going to help me unpack why some politicians are centering their opinions on LGBTQ plus rights when the majority of their constituents don't want them to. 888-720-9677 is the number to call if you'd like to talk to us today, 888-720-9677. Hey, TJ, here on the Wheelhouse, we love following news coming out of the 19th. Amanda Becker, their Washington correspondent, recently wrote about the governor's race in West Virginia and how the candidates seem to be trying to one-up each other on who can restrict LGBTQ plus rights more. But one fascinating part of her piece was that a poll conducted last year by SurveyMonkey for the 19th showed that just 17% of Americans, only 29% of Republicans, believe that politicians should focus on restricting access to gender-affirming care. Why are these politicians' priorities not necessarily aligning with their constituents' priorities, TJ?
Well, I think it's a hard question to ask because it makes a lot of kind of assumptions about the relationship between public desire and democratic governance that I think very unfortunately doesn't always bear out. I think there are a lot of things that we could look to where we can see similar things, whether that's things like reproductive care or any myriad number of economic issues. But I think that what makes anti-trans politics so particularly central among in particular right-wing elected officials is because they operate under the assumption that people have not just built-in anti-trans prejudices, but that they experience a particular kind of disorientation at our public acceptance of and changing attitudes towards trans people, that trans people are kind of disrupting the order of what it means to be a man, to be a woman, and for those to be the only two categories that one can be. And if society is changing in ways that is more hospitable to trans people, it means like the rules of gender in society are changing. And for a lot of people, that can be really kind of confusing. It can be quite scary. It can make you feel kind of out of step with the rest of society. And I think politicians are really hoping that they can capitalize on that kind of anxiety to mobilize people to be like, oh, we need someone to help keep the world the way I understand it. I think that that is a bit of a miscalculation, as some survey numbers have shown. But also, like Joanna was just saying, those numbers are changing and they are not getting better for trans people. And so I do think that the extent to which politicians on the right have been able to manufacture that kind of crisis has had notable deleterious effects, not just on the policies that affect trans people's lives, but also on public attitudes towards trans people that that then affect just their navigation of life every day.
I really appreciate you bringing that up at the end because that is important. This is having some kind of impact. Now I have to ask you, TJ, if you could somehow quantify that. Is there any kind of study or anything like that in particular that you've seen where you've been able to see some of these deleterious impacts?
So I don't necessarily have something that immediately is at the top of mind
Anecdotal?
to in terms of a quantification. But yeah, I think what is particularly notable among a lot of trans people is also just the degree to which strangers in everyday life seem more inclined to and certainly more interested in identifying them as trans. I think that for a lot of people, the kind of omnipresence of trans people in, or not necessarily actually trans people, but trans people as a topic of discussion in media has meant that a lot of trans people find their genders more scrutinized on a daily basis when they interact with people. And when people are kind of constantly inspecting you to see whether they think that you're trans or not, and then treating you differently based on the answer that they decide. And, we've seen that, for example, in places where bans on restroom access have been implemented, where gender or people cisgender, which is to say non-transgender people whose appearance maybe is like not traditionally perfectly feminine or masculine, where perhaps because of biology or perhaps because of the way they present themselves socially, they don't cleanly fit that, they get viewed as being trans and then harassed for it. And so I think that it's increasing in some ways the kind of sideways surveillance that people in everyday life are doing on trans people, and as an extension of that, on cis people who other cis people think might be trans.
What a society you're pointing out here. This kind of thing happening. You talked about anxiety earlier. How's the media contributing to all of this? How can we in the media fall victim to some of these things that lawmakers are talking about and really stoking?
Yeah, I want to actually echo something that Joanna said about these kind of merchants of scientific uncertainty, because I think that that's really key to what's happening in media in particular, which is that media are, by and large, kind of allowing these merchants of scientific doubt who peddle that unreasonable doubt. And in a way that is kind of shocking, because if we were to think, for example, about another domain of medicine, and one that is actually full of much more scientific ambiguity than gender medicine is, something like cancer treatment, we would never say the New York Times should equally represent the opinions of critics of cancer care. And but we somehow have the view that that is not only acceptable, but responsible for journalists to do that when it comes to coverage of gender affirming care. And so we have outlets like the New York Times that are kind of the most salient example just because of their standing in the media sphere, but far from alone in this, but like legitimating perspectives that from a scientific evaluation standpoint are not legitimate. And my kind of hypothesis as to why has to do with the extent to which anti-trans scientific views have become so closely aligned with right-wing politics that to deny that they feel as though they then are kind of mediating a political conflict and they're picking one side over the other. But that, to me, is a misread of the situation, because the sides are not political, they are scientific. And politics has kind of grafted itself onto that.
Caitlin Burns, columnist, MSNBC, and host of the Cancel Me Daddy podcast. We've had some brief discussions before, Caitlin, so I don't want you to think that I'm pouring gasoline on the fire. I'm not necessarily having you go after a particular group here, but we've heard from Joanna and now we've heard from TJ on one particular media outlet. What do you think the New York Times and other media outlets can do to avoid some of these problems?
God, I wish I had a great answer to this.
I'm just not trying to tell you to go after somebody here today, you know, and I'm trying to be nice here and I guess diplomatic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the New York Times has decided that they want to appeal to a certain editorial bent when it comes to trans issues that I don't agree with. I think that they actually have their thumb on the scales of justice when it comes to trans issues. I don't know if there's an editor over there who has an axe to grind with trans people or feels squicked out by, I don't know, my existence. I don't know what it is. But I have not found their reporting on trans issues to be as reliable as you would hope. And actually, you know, we talk about sometimes the two national paper battle between the New York Times and the Washington Post. I actually think the Washington Post has done a consistently better job covering the so-called debate over youth gender care than the New York Times has. And again, I don't want to target individual people, but
you did such a great job pointing us to somewhere where maybe we can get a little better coverage. So there you go. We're growing together here, Caitlin.
Yeah.
We're adulting today. Hey, you were the first ever openly trans Capitol Hill reporter. Talk to me about that experience and maybe not necessarily on how it impacted the way you do your job, but I guess the landscape now, because I would imagine that we're always thinking about the second and third openly trans person and the fourth and so forth.
Yeah, so I was the first one. I will say I was always treated well by everybody on the Hill, Democrats, Republicans. It didn't make a difference. I will point out this was back in 2018. I think the political landscape around trans issues was not quite as prominent at the time. You know, Marjorie Taylor Greene was not in Congress when I was covering the Hill, so I do wonder if I would have run into issues there. But actually, I saw recently that the second openly trans Capitol Hill reporter just recently resigned from her job over her publication's coverage of trans political issues. So, you know, and she has come out and said she was always treated very well. She covered climate, but she was treated very well by Democrats and Republicans themselves. So, I don't think this is an interpersonal issue. I do have a lot of concerns over the way the media portrays this as sort of two sides, give and take. But I do think that there's real value in having trans reporters sort of in and
What
around
about
the
when you
halls of
don't?
power.
What about when you don't?
Yeah, I think you lose something there. And I told you this story before, but when I was covering Congress, I distinctly remember talking with Representative Ro Khanna, who was the, I believe, author and primary co-sponsor of the Medicare for All bill. And this was before this sort of moral panic over gender youth care that is happening now. That wasn't quite on the horizon yet for mainstream politics. And I remember asking Ro, I'm like, hey, I don't see anything in the bill language about specific protections for gender affirming care. I know it's covered, but like, what happens if like a Republican gets elected to the White House and decides we're not covering this anymore? And he stops and he looks at me, and the first thing he says is, well, no one's ever asked me about this before. And I think that it's significant that it took, a trans person, a trans reporter asking about things that concern trans people specifically, to actually get those questions asked. Because I don't think your average cisgender reporter has this on the mind when it comes to a Medicare for All bill. And I think when you don't have a trans reporter asking these questions, you lose that. You lose something in the decision-making process.
So it sounds like overall LGBTQ plus representation in the media, at least when it comes to transgender persons, is getting worse. What about representation in Congress? I believe this now most recent Congress is a record in terms of LGBTQ plus membership.
Yeah, so I will stipulate it is a record. However, there has yet to be an openly trans member of Congress. I think that is going to change this fall. I think that State Senator Sarah McBride from Delaware is likely to win her race for Congress, based on the polling that I've seen. So I think we could be seeing our first openly trans U.S. representative, which I think is a really, really exciting sort of next step for trans politics.
We call that foreshadowing. I think it's going to be important to talk about representation in Congress as we look to the rest of 2024 and the impact LGBTQ plus issues and rights will have, or at least the way that people look like this and potentially targeting LGBTQ plus rights will have on the upcoming election. You could join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. You're listening to The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. In Connecticut, Republican lawmakers floated two bills this session containing anti-trans rhetoric. According to CT News Junkie, one of the bills would notify parents if there was some kind of transition occurring at school, and another would reverse the state's policy of allowing athletes to compete under the gender to which they identify. The proposals never got to the floor of the state legislature. Today, we've looked into how state and federal lawmakers have politicized a form of medical and therapeutic care. And in our final segment, we're talking about how all of that reaches the public. We're talking about LGBTQ plus rights and representation in the media and in Congress. Joined this morning by TJ Billard, associate professor at Northwestern University. Also here with Caitlin Burns, who is the host of Cancel Me Daddy, the podcast, and a columnist at MSNBC. Join the conversation if you'd like, 888-720-9677. TJ, I think we can go back a bit here to set the scene. You wrote about how Trump's administration, former President Donald Trump, from 2016 to 2020 had a big impact on the transgender community. Can you talk about how activists mobilized during that time?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that is really crucial to what happened under the Trump administration is obviously that the degree of focus on trans people, particularly among Republican politicians seeking to emulate Trump, increased significantly, which meant that it was kind of very much an all hands on deck approach to, in large part, trying to combat misinformation that was rapidly proliferating. Also, of course, trying to just increase the amount that members of the public were getting their understanding of what it means to be trans from trans people instead of from opponents of trans rights. But one of the things that we saw during the Trump administration that I think we have not seen since then was the degree of allyship from non-trans people. I think in large part, during the Trump administration, many people across a kind of wide spectrum of identities and experience were really willing to kind of lock arms with trans people because they viewed the Trump administration's assaults on trans people as part of a kind of more broader repressive kind of fascistic political project. But once Trump was out of office, that amount of kind of emphasis on continuing to protect trans people diminished, even as state level assaults on trans people have increased year on year, such that they are now significantly more intense than they were during the Trump administration. And so I think what has happened is that trans activists, as a small percentage of the population, trans people already are, this even smaller percentage that are professional activists, the amount of work that needs to be done is greater than ever, and the number of people doing it is less than it had been in recent memory. And so right now, I think it's quite concerning state for trans people as trans issues have kind of been sidelined in progressive politics.
And you would both say that that allies are maybe becoming complacent, or at least there was. I'm trying to just get to the tipping point of where this all happened. You would say that it was after Trump was out of office and Joe Biden came in. It was just that there just wasn't as much support from outside the trans community.
Yeah, I think that the amount of priority given to protecting trans people certainly diminished. And I think that we've seen that that's not like an exclusive phenomenon to trans people. I also think it's very evident how much, for example, activists fighting for reproductive rights have experienced kind of diminishing support and diminishing attention in the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision, which, if anything, made their activism more important, not less. And yet the attention and the support has, I think, diminished notably.
So, Caitlin, does that mean that, and I know you can't look at the crystal ball here, but what does that mean? Just help us understand what that means for anti-LGBTQ plus legislation. Does that mean because this allyship at least has been diminishing lately, or support, that it could be worse, or is there some kind of silver lining here?
I think it's been interesting watching all of this develop of late. You saw a really big push, particularly the last 2 years, to pass as much anti-trans legislation as possible, at least on the state level. There have been federal efforts as well to do this. But if you look at the actual campaigns that happened, the close general election battles that are in purple districts or purple states, what you see is a trend of the Republicans who really make persecuting trans people into the centerpiece of their campaigns. A lot of them are losing, and a lot of them are losing surprisingly. And I think what you've seen this year, the pace of the passage of these anti-trans bills has significantly slowed, I think because we're in a general election year. And you're not seeing as much rhetoric. I'm not seeing as much rhetoric as I expected against trans people so far during this campaign year. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that voters, at the end of the day, they're not voting because of trans people. They're voting because of their pocketbooks. They're voting because of a personal issue that matters to them. And I think, quite frankly, not a lot of Americans still personally know a trans person. So it's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, they don't know a trans person, so they don't know if the rhetoric being spewed about us is true or false. But on the other hand, they don't know a trans person, so they're not really voting based on what their legislators are doing to trans people. So, I'm very interested to see how things go this fall, and whether or not we see the just the onslaught of bills return next year when there's no general election.
TJ, a Gallup poll says the number of Gen Zers identifying as transgender is almost double the number of millennials who identify as trans. So, in looking to what Caitlin was just talking about here, maybe it's voters. Maybe there's more voters that could think about trans issues here in the future if more people identify that way. Is that something, or will significant change require more than just age and representation there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are kind of two things going on there. One of which is there's certainly going to be a social and cultural impact of more people identifying as trans. And I think that we've certainly seen that, for example, with previously gays and lesbians, and the amount that waves of coming out and increasing numbers of people being out, public and visible, had a really dramatic impact on the rate at which attitudes and opinions about gays and lesbians transformed. And so that absolutely will happen. More people will know a trans person personally, and more people will be more aware of what it means to be trans. And all of that will happen, and with it will come certain kinds of change. I don't know that we can say firmly anything about what that will mean for electoral politics, for a few reasons. One, that's waiting a long time for those demographic shifts to happen. Two, that it assumes kind of more active rates of voting among younger populations than we typically see. But I think most crucially, it assumes a kind of one-to-one relationship between what a population looks like and its ability to exercise political influence in line with their demographics. We know that we live in a form of democratic government in which that is not the case, with things like gerrymandering, the electoral college, various forms of voter disenfranchisement, violations of the Voting Rights Act, and so on. I think that our kind of confidence that there are more queer and trans people, they can vote in pro-trans people, is not as solid as we would hope.
We got only a minute left on the show, unfortunately. So, Caitlin, I'll give you the last one here. Just listeners out there looking for actionable steps to support the LGBTQ plus community, especially as we move closer to the presidential election. Although you're not necessarily hearing as much rhetoric, so I guess that's a good thing. Specific bills they should be advocating for or against, or specific books they could help them understand the landscape. And hopefully you could do that in 15, 20 seconds, Caitlin.
Oh God, that's a big ask. I don't have specific resources. I mean, there are a lot of great queer organizations that you can donate your money to. I would look for the politicians that aren't afraid to take a stand for trans rights. But I think most of all, I would just ask your listenership to just remember that trans people are human too. We are part of your community, even though you might not see us every day. We shop at your supermarkets. We're on the roads with you.
Thank
we
you
talked
so
about
much,
the Connecticut
Caitlin.
roads.
I hate cutting you off there,
No,
but
it's
this
okay.
is the Wheelhouse. Thank you so much for listening. That was a great show.